joining us for the first time here for this session, where we're turning now to Africa to look at Catholicity and Incarnated Identities. Africa, in terms of world Catholicism, is the fastest growing continent and a source of tremendous vitality. So I'm looking very much forward to what our two speakers will be presenting. Our first speaker will be Professor Eunice Karanja Kamaara, who teaches at Moi University in Kenya, and also is an affiliate professor at Indiana University and Purdue University here in this country. She is a specialist in ethics over a wide range of different fields within ethics, the medical, theological, and gender issues. She has published a book on gender, youth sexuality, and HIV/AIDS, as well as a considerable number of contributions to other works, and also she's co-edited 3 books in the area of church, health ethics, and development, and does also online work on bioethics. So looking very much forward to what she will be presenting. After her presentation, we will have our second presentation immediately following that, and Father Agbonkhianmeghe Orobator will be our speaker. Father Orobator is the Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in East Africa and an accomplished theologian. We were talking a little before the session, and I was telling him in many ways the rest of us can't wait for his term as Provincial to end so that he can return full-time to his work in theology. The book for perhaps he's best known in this country is his 2008 publication, Theology, Brewed in an African Hunt. But he has also been involved with many of the social and ethical issues that are facing Africa today, working around issues of HIV/AIDS, refugees, and poverty. So he will be our second speaker, and we look forward to hearing from him as well. Our procedure in this session will be, each of our presenters will give their presentation, and then we will open it up for audience participation as well. So I think we can begin. Professor Kamaara.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about Catholicity and Incarnated Identities, and basically give 1 or 2 cases which are controversial from Africa. And I'm very specific that this is from Africa, because Africa is not a homogeneous unit. There are very many communities with diverse languages, cultures, political organizations, and so on. In my own country, Kenya, where I come from, we have over 42 different groups, each with its distinct language and distinct cultures. However, it's possible to talk about Africa in general because there are few commonalities in terms of basic beliefs, even though their expressions or their interpretations may differ from one community to another. In this presentation, I'm hoping that I can share a few ideas on Catholicity and Incarnated Identities. I can show the complexity of cultural contexts in Africa. I can share 1 or 2 controversial cases, and I hope I can raise controversy. And basically, I'll be raising questions without giving answers, basically to invite you to some kind of dialogue. I hope not to take a lot of time on this, but basically I would like to say that I belong to the group of scholars who would prefer to talk about Catholicity rather than Catholicism. So that from the onset, we have an understanding of something that is open rather than closed. Of course, we all agree that Catholicity is about unity in the belief, specifically in Jesus Christ, through whom God's saving grace comes to all of us. And here I underline John chapter 17, verses 22, which is Jesus' prayer, that we may be one, just as Christ and the Father and the Holy Spirit are one, in spite of their different identities. And I look at Catholicity as universal, where universality is not about homogeneity, it's about diversity, and it's also about dynamism. Very often when we think about Africa, we tend to think in terms of traditional beliefs and practices. But Africa, like all societies, is dynamic. All the societies in Africa are dynamic. And therefore we have issues arising out of new contexts and arising out of dynamism. But essentially we want to appreciate that Catholics are brought together by the basic understanding of Christ the Savior, even though this understanding may be understood, may be interpreted, and may be expressed differently in different contexts. In terms of incarnation, I look at it as the assumption of an earthly form by a God, so that we have the mystery and the dogma of the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among men. And with other theologians who have said this, I say it, that the Word does not drop into the world. It becomes flesh. Incarnation is about it becoming flesh and lifting creation to a new level, where we become dignified as humanity who share an origin with God. And therefore, in terms of incarnated identities, it's extremely important for us to appreciate that the Catholic faith is a movement within history. There's no way we can understand Catholicity outside history. And as we all know, human beings are limited, particularly because of their physical human nature. And this is in spite of their supernatural being. And therefore we find that there are challenges of being Catholic in cultural contexts. And as Richard Nebo puts it in his book, Christ and Culture, there is a constant tension between the world in which we live and the heaven from which we came and to which we go. And Richard Nebo describes it as the double wrestle of the church with its Lord and with the cultural society with which it lives in symbiosis. I wish to underline the word symbiosis. Now let's turn to Catholicity in Africa. What does it mean to be a Catholic and an African? Theologians have talked about a double identity and double consciousness. I see more than double identities. I see triple identities. I see multi-identities. And this is where I bring out the complexity. In the multiple identities, I bring out the complexity of African identity. Africa is at crossroads right now. We have our traditional beliefs and practices, our traditional worldview, which continues to guide us in very many ways. But we also have modern worldviews, global worldview, as we participate in globalization, consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly. And we also have Catholic identity. So at least there are triple identities for every African, as far as I see it. But what then does Catholicity call these people that we are calling Africans into? What does it call them to be, given their traditional values, given the challenges and the realities of our modern world? We probably wouldn't understand this unless we understand a little about the traditional African worldview and a little about the modern realities. And so I begin by looking at the African traditional worldview. The traditional African culture is theocratic, with a dominating sense of God everywhere, a dominating sense of the sacred, of the numinous. And within this African spirituality, if we may call it so, human life is of greatest value. The most valuable thing is human life. And there are two defining characteristics of African spirituality in the context of incarnated identities. And one of these characteristics is the value of progeny. The value of progeny. And the other characteristic is the centrality of relationships. If we focus a little on the value of progeny, we can observe that in Africa, there are cultural expectations of a person to have a family and to have children. Every person is expected to have a family and to have children. And part of the reason why this is expected is so that the family name can continue. And it's not just the name continues, but in the name, the family continues. There's perpetuation of life, perpetuation of the clan, perpetuation of the family, and so on. And one of the worst things that can happen to an African from a traditional worldview, which continues to impress on people today, is to die without a child. If you die without a child, you have brought an end to your family name. You've brought an end to your clan. You've brought an end to humanity. And therefore, you don't seem to have value in human life. Perpetuation of human life is considered utmost. If you look at naming system in many communities in Africa, specifically in Kenya, the most honorable titles are not professors or bishops, but mother or father. So unlike in probably Europe and America, where people call one another by their names, in Africa, we call one another by our children's name as soon as people become mothers and become fathers. So that back home, I'm more widely known as Mama Edita, that is mother of Edita. So that my identity is very much linked to my motherhood. Because through that motherhood, I perpetuate humanity. I perpetuate family name. I perpetuate the family to which I belong. And there is a lot of prestige in big families. Very often I'm uncomfortable, even though I consider myself not traditional, but modern, and many people would probably consider me modern. I'm very uncomfortable when people ask me, how many children do you have? And it's a common question across Africa. The minute you say your name, somebody will call you, are you married? That will be the next question. You say yes. The next question will be, how many children do you have? I get very uncomfortable when we get there because I am not prestigious in the sense that I don't have many children. But it is expected of Africans that they should have very many children and therefore many descendants. And in this sense, there's the place where the Roman Catholic anti-contraception rule is very much followed is probably in Africa because it links up with this expectation. So marriage is not an option. And probably before I go on, I would like to say that I am Roman Catholic, all right, I'm Catholic, but by marriage. I'm not Catholic by birth, and I'm not Catholic by upbringing. So in a sense, Catholicism is something that I have picked up in my adult life. I'm Presbyterian by birth and Presbyterian by upbringing. And secondly, I am not, of course, if I'm Catholic, then I'm not clergy, which makes it very easy for me to talk about incarnated identities, because basically there is no question of censorship. Additionally, I teach in a public university, something like a secular university, and so I very easily talk about these things without fear or favor. So marriage is not an option for many communities in Africa from a traditional worldview. And that's why you find that there are many structures for ensuring that there is marriage and there is perpetuation of life through marriage. So we have levirate marriages in Africa. We have polygamy, both man with many wives and woman with many husbands. Both of them are found in Africa. We have wife guardianship, which is commonly referred to as wife inheritance, but it's not inheritance. It's actually wife guardianship. We have woman-to-woman marriage. It's possible for a woman to marry another woman for purposes of perpetuation of life. If I get old and I don't have as many children as I would have liked to get, it's possible for me to marry another woman, bring her into my compound, and get children, not for herself, but for me. So there are various structures in place to ensure that there's a large progeny. The other value is centrality of relationships. And here we are talking about relationships with God. Individual responsibility with God, as well as collective responsibility and relationship with God. There is also relationship with oneself, relationship with fellow human persons, relationship with all forms of life, whether they are animals or birds or reptiles, all sorts of life. And there's also relationship with the rest of creation. So that among traditional Africans, inanimate things, even something like this podium here, has vital force, has some force, so that if you don't relate with it in a healthy way, it can fight back, more or less. So it's expected that human beings have healthy relationships with God, with one another, with everything. And when they have healthy relationships, then we have life. Life is perpetuated, life is protected through healthy relationships. And when these relationships break, so that we have unhealthy relationships, then we have situations of disease. We have situations of ill health. And at worst, we can have death. So in Africa, you find that there is nothing like a natural death from the traditional perspective. When somebody dies, even if it's an accident, people will talk about he was killed. Meaning, he just didn't die. There must be a cause to his death. And the cause will very often be linked to some unhealthy relationship. So all deaths in Africa are caused. All diseases are caused. And therefore it's important to establish the cause of disease before you can attempt to treat it. It's important to appreciate the cause of ill health before you can attempt to treat it. But Africa, at the same time, has a modern worldview. I said Africa is at crossroads. We continue to be influenced by traditional African thinking, but we are also influenced by the modern worldview. And more specifically, what I refer to as neoliberal capitalism, characterized by individualism. We are very happy to pride of our cup overflowing, even if the neighbor's cup is empty. There is materialism. We are no longer thinking in terms of relationships fully. At some point, we want to think in terms of relationships as the governing principle. But in other situations, we want to think in terms of what we possess, as what accesses as good health or good life. And we are also caught up in consumerism. When I was in primary school, we had a teacher. Primary school is first 7 years of education, basic education. We had a teacher who used to ask us, are you in the world to live, or are you eating to live? Are you living to eat, or are you eating to live? In a consumerist society, we more or less live to eat. So what then are the controversies? For me, the greatest controversy in Africa is whether to marry or not to marry. With specific reference to mandatory celibacy in the Catholic Church. And I'm like, how would you call people not to marry if for those people, their mindset indicates that there is utmost value in progeny? And one of the questions that is asked around is whether celibacy is a defining characteristic of Catholicity. Must I be celibate as a priest for me to have a Catholic identity? If I cease to be celibate, do I cease to be Catholic? And to quote one of the priests in Africa who has joined a group of Catholics who are now getting married, isn't sex a basic human need? Isn't it a basic human right? So that to withdraw it is to ask me to cease to be human. And if I'm no longer human, how can you then ask me to be a Catholic? Isn't to be a Catholic to be human? Isn't sex God's gift for all? Does it set some of us apart so that we become less human by denying ourselves of sex for service? But then, the next question that one would raise is sex too great a gift? Not too great a sacrifice, not a gift. Is sex too great a sacrifice for anyone to give in service of God? I said I'll raise questions and I won't answer them. And the examples that we have, the cases that we have, I'll mention only two. We have the Catholic Apostolic National Church, formed in Uganda in 2010. And this is a group of priests who are married. They're saying, I can be Catholic and married at the same time. So they are saying, it's not necessary for me to give up sex in order to provide service and adequate service to Christ. In Kenya, we have the Reformed Catholic Church. And the most popular person in that group is Father Godfrey Chiutu. And we also have the Catholic Diocese of One Spirit in Kenya. Among the members of that church is Father Jude Ongonga. We have the Ecumenical Catholic Church of Christ. Among the notable people is John Karimi, Reverend John Karimi. And so we have examples. And I thought I could capture it graphically and show you this picture from the web. You can access it on the web. Of Bishop Milingo of Zambia ordaining Father Kasomo. Father Kasomo is actually a personal friend of mine. He teaches in a public university in Kenya. He teaches religious studies. He's my colleague. So we see him after ordination by Archbishop Milingo. I don't know whether he's still Archbishop, I don't know whether he's just Bishop, whatever. As a former Archbishop of the Catholic Church in Zambia, but has now moved on to associate with married priests. And I have another picture that is Father Godflesh Yundu of the Reformed Catholic Church in Kenya when he officiated his wedding with a nurse in Kitale, about 1 hour from where I live. And we have Father John Kalimi of the Kenya Ecumenical Catholic Church of Christ, and that marks his wedding. Now, these are just pictures, these are just cases of people who have claimed to remain Catholic even after coming out of celibacy, even after going against their vows of celibacy. But the controversy in it comes from the response that they have received from the Catholic Church. We are all familiar with what happened to Archbishop Milingo. He was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church after a series of events trying to domesticate him. When the church was frustrated trying to domesticate Archbishop Milingo, he was thrown out of the church. Godflesh Yudu, we are talking about something that happened about 5 years ago. The Bishop of Kitale Diocese in Kenya excommunicated Godflesh Yudu for getting married and asked the faithful in his diocese not to associate with Godflesh Yudu. John Kalembi, his picture is still up there, is from the Nyeri Diocese in Kenya. He too was excommunicated by his bishop for getting married. The other controversy that I would like to turn our attention to is the controversy on spirituality. Remember, we talked about the value of progeny, and we also talked about the centrality of relationships in African worldview. In Kenya, we have the Kenya Catholic Charismatic Renewal. This is a group of Catholics who have chosen to do things a little different from the Catholic Church, with a lot of emphasis on the Holy Spirit, and specifically on divine healing, with the understanding, with the mindset that relationships and healthy relationships is what cause disease. It is understood that to heal, you need to understand the unhealthy relationships and to restore them. And it's in the context of relationships that we talk about witchcraft in Africa. Very many people will say, I'm ailing because I was bewitched. And for a person whose mindset is clear that he's ailing because he's bewitched, you're not going to heal him until you address his bewitchment. And to address witchcraft, you do not need modern medicine. You do not need material interventions. So the Catholic Charismatic Renewal will appeal to spiritual healing, will appeal to faith healing. And healing is basically seen as a process of restoring broken relationships. And unlike the Catholic Church, they'll put emphasis on baptism with the Holy Spirit. So some of the groups you speak in tongues, some of the groups you engage in all kinds of Pentecostal activities, but they are saying we are still Catholics. We are within Catholicism. We are within Catholicity. And some of them will be insisting on extravagant liturgical dances, very much like we see in Pentecostalism. Now we are calling this a controversy because there is no clear position by the Roman Catholic Church or by the Catholic Church, if you wish, in Africa, on whether these people are Catholics or they are not. At some point, Catholic bishops will condemn the Catholic charismatic renewal in various parts of Africa. And I'm not just talking about Kenya here. I'm only using illustrations from Kenya, which is what I'm familiar with. So you find that in February 2009, for example, Cardinal Jue of Kenya banned, but only by oral pronouncement, the Catholic charismatic renewal. The Catholic charismatic renewal came up more or less in 2000, towards the end of 2008. That's when it became very pronounced. And by the way, this is influence coming not just from traditional mindset, but also from America. And that's why I'm saying we are talking about a complex cultural context. So we have people who have a traditional mindset, but at the same time, they are being influenced from America. So 2008, the movement becomes rife, and in February 2009, Cardinal Jue bans it, but he bans it only by an oral pronouncement. It's very significant that it was only oral, because it means the bishop was not quite sure that he was ready to put anything on paper. And it is no wonder that soon after, the ban was lifted. So that from the perspective of the Cardinal and of the Kenya Episcopal Conference, the Catholic charismatic renewal may not go on, depending on what the individual bishops think. So in some dioceses in Kenya, the Catholic charismatic renewal is very vibrant. In my own local church, the Catholic charismatic renewal is very, very vibrant. And once in a while we have a church service, immediately after the regular service for the Catholic charismatic renewal. What does it say when we say it's not coming in the regular service, it's coming immediately after? What are we saying? That it's not Catholic? And yet it's running within the church. And basically all that the charismatics are called to do is to respect authority. And of course the case, I go back to the case of Archbishop Milingo because it had both issues. It was a case of going against the mandatory celibacy, and it was also a case of healing, faith healing. But it's also an interesting case because it's complicated by modernity. Bishop Milingo was married at 76, at the age of 76. But he was married in a mass wedding. Mass wedding is something very modern. It comes with information technology. And he's getting married not to an African, but to a Korean. So what does the church say in the midst of this? Visiting Uganda for the canonization of the Ugandan martyrs in 1969, Pope Paul VI said, formulate Catholicism in terms congenial to your own culture. You may and you must have an African Christianity. So what was the Pope saying? Was he saying you may marry and be Catholic? Was he saying you may exercise faith healing and still marry? His predecessor, Pope, is it predecessor or whatever, the one who came after him, Pope John Paul II, visiting Nairobi in 1980, upheld the position of Pope Paul VI, and he said, thus, not only is Christianity relevant to Africa, but Christ is in the members of his body is himself African. Christ is African. This is what Pope John Paul II was saying. So what does it mean to be African? Was Pope John Paul II saying, priests may marry? Was he saying, priests may exercise Pentecostalism? But at the same time, we see a lot of incidences where the Vatican is slowing down Africanization. The same Pope John Paul II, speaking in Nigeria, soon after the visit in Nairobi, says, we have to rely on grace to resist temptation against celibacy. So I'm like, how do we read these two statements? How do we interpret them? How do we understand them? And of course, we've already mentioned the fact that Cardinal Jue in Kenya banned the charismatic renewal, and barely 5 months later, he lifted the ban. So in lifting the ban, what was he saying? In pronouncing a ban, what was he saying? In terms of way forward, I'm wondering, how can being Catholic refine culture in the context of a changing world? In what ways can being a Catholic help Africans refine their culture in the context of a changing world? And I'm thinking that the correct term here is indeed refinement. So that we are saying that the culture is fine. We are not saying that culture is not fine, it's fine. We are already refining it. Meaning there are certain aspects of culture which we may hold on to, there are certain aspects of culture which we may not hold on to. And for me, I think the important thing is to distinguish between the negotiable word of God and the non-negotiable. The negotiable and the non-negotiable. There are certain things we can't negotiate as Catholics. They are given. You remove them and you cease to be Catholic. But there are also certain things which are non-negotiable. Which are negotiable. You can remove them and still be a Catholic. So our task basically is to identify what is non-negotiable and what is negotiable. Is celibacy negotiable? Is celibacy non-negotiable? Is healing, specifically faith healing, negotiable? Is it non-negotiable? And I'm also looking at the Catholic Church and saying that those who have accused it of exaggerated docility are right. The Catholic Church in Africa has been a little docile, not taking advantage of certain pronouncements, not taking advantage of situations to negotiate for an African Catholic identity. And in the context of neoliberal capitalism, I say the church in Africa, Catholics in Africa, have to avoid abuse of diversity for selfish ends. They shouldn't be pushing for certain things for selfish ends. And in my concluding remarks, I see no better words to close my discussion than the words of Pope Paul VI in 1965 in his encyclical. The Catholic vocation is to heal, to ennoble, and to perfect all the authentic values present in traditions and cultures of various people. So our task as Catholics is to heal, to ennoble, to perfect authentic values. So what are the authentic values? How do we identify that which is authentic? And we are saying we need to identify what can be negotiated and what cannot be negotiated. And before us is a parallel opportunity to become agents of inclusion and dialogue in a world that so desperately needs these values. Thank you very much.
Son say this for two reasons. First, because this morning I'm thinking about the recent attack in Boston and people who've lost lives, limbs. I also sing it because in the context of Incarnated Identities, this is a song that I sang before I became a Christian, and I still sing. It is a song that for me represents that bridge between my identity as an African, steeped very much in African religion, and now celebrated with much confidence and joy as a Catholic. I will be talking about incarnated identities and referring to Africa, but I also want to make it clear that I am using this term, Africa, in a rather loose manner, because it's, as my colleague has just pointed out, it's a very complex reality in terms of history and culture and demography and politics and economy. It's a very complex reality. But most of the presentation would deal with Africa south of the Sahara. And talking about this continent, one of the things I found interesting about it is the many nicknames that the continent has. And the fact that many of these nicknames denote primitiveness and savagery. Some of the samples of the infamous ones would be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Henry Morton Stanley's Dark Continent, and in 2000, The Economist magazine branded the continent as the hopeless continent. And there is one of my favorites by William Whitaker Shreve, The White Man's Tomb, or The White Man's Grave. Now, of course, I believe that this practice of name-calling or nicknaming Africa reinforces stereotypical thinking that is very deeply embedded in colonial portrayal of the continent's complex identity and history. And so what you find really is that because of this name-calling, Africa remains the most misunderstood of continents, crippled in our imagination by images rooted in the minds of imperial Europeans who attempted to shape and invent an Africa useful to their political ambitions. Let's go back to 1847. 1847, a man named William Whitaker Shreve, a colonial officer in Sierra Leone, offered a very somber account of Africa's religious identity, a very frightful prognosis of Christianity's missionary adventure on the continent. Shreve wrote, Africa, like all countries where Christianity has not penetrated or where it progresses but slowly, is doomed to the darkness of pagan superstition or of idolatrous rites, polygamy, lust, licentiousness, and all the vices. For until some great revolution in nature or some great and gradual human exertion takes place, it must ever prove the white man's grave. And truly may it be said that Africa's shores are paved with the white man's bones and its graveyards filled with monuments of lost exertions. But as Christians, we should and must persevere. Now, you have to take your mind back to the historical and geographical context of Shreve's, I would say, morbid prediction. 19th century Africa was not a picnic site. It was a very intimidating terrain, even for the most intrepid of missionaries and colonialists and explorers and bounty hunters. The high mortality rate, the harsh tropical climate, rampant diseases, and poor sanitation guaranteed the instant demise of white missionaries and colonialists and accentuated the futility of their evangelical exertions and political ambitions. Now, the habit of nicknaming Africa has endured into the 21st century, although we could say now that it has evolved into a slightly more benign nomenclature. And so, more than a century and a half after William Shreve, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI coined another alias for the continent. Africa, he declared, constitutes an immense spiritual lung for a humanity that appears to be in a crisis of faith and hope. Now, the way I look at it, this flattering designation expresses an implicit belief in the potential of the religious fortunes of this continent, Africa, to oxygenate a humanity that is starved of spiritual sustenance. So you may be wondering, what is the point of this long-winded introduction? Well, here's the point. The evolution of nomenclature, say from Shreve's white man's grave to Benedict's immense spiritual lung, I believe is symptomatic of the trajectory of Christianity's progress in Africa. It is symptomatic of the progress of Christianity in Africa. For when you look at it from the perspective of religious adherence and affiliation, beliefs and practices, it is clear that Africa lies on an axis of growth. Demographic growth has been variously characterized as astronomical, phenomenal, and spectacular. John Allen, who spoke to us yesterday, once remarked that if I were asked to offer a history of Roman Catholicism in the 20th century in one sentence, I would reply, the center of gravity shifted from north to south. Now, scholars and experts would agree that the transformation of African Catholicism is integral to this history of the growth of Christianity in Africa. And don't we say statistics, of course, don't lie. Sub-Saharan Africa has, as we now know, 500 million Christians, making it the region with the third largest number of Christians worldwide, and representing a very important percentage of the total number of Christians across the globe. This data also shows the rapid growth of Catholicism on the continent in the span of a century, a fact that has recently prompted an imaginative Spanish journalist to nickname Africa a factory of Catholic souls. I would like to make a few points now about identity, or rather identities in Africa. In Africa, south of the Sahara, the religious person by necessity operates between multiple religious polarities that shape his or her identity. In other words, religious identity is not a matter of simple affiliation or adherence, practice of beliefs, or profession of faith. Rather, it involves a complex combination of factors, intersection of processes, and overlapping points of reference. And so to be a Catholic, for example, is to define oneself always in relation to a multiplicity of faith traditions and denominations. And the bonds of allegiance to a single pole can be stronger or weaker depending on one's immediate circumstances and interests. Specifically, this means that Catholic identity is incarnated at multiple levels or loci of religious practice. The space and experience of one's identity are almost always heterogeneous or loosely circumscribed. Devotees of various different faiths or traditions navigate and traverse these borders at will. And I would say that for me, this situation produces what I call an economy of identities that allows for flexibility and fluidity in delineating the borders of religious belief, practice, and allegiance. And so to understand how religious identity is formed on the continent and how it functions, it is important to pay attention to the dynamics of this economy of identities. The second point I wish to make: the overlay of religious identities also means an overload of religious identities. The religious African is a bearer of multiple religious heritages, and I will put myself in that category. In addition to indigenous tradition, Christianity and Islam form part of Africa's religious traditions. And each one of these traditions, Islam and Christianity, has a significant demographic representation and presence on the continent. And so today, we know that Christianity and Islam have become the two largest religions in Africa. My third point, and it's a consequence of the preceding point about overload of identities, so that as a consequence of this overload of multiple religious identities, the space within which a person defines his or her particular identity is marked by intense competition among a variety of religious faiths and traditions. And the list again would include Islam, Protestantism, Pentecostalism, African instituted churches, and of course, African religion. And so in this context, what I notice is that to form identity is to negotiate a series of border points across a vast religious landscape. A vast religious landscape. And what are some of these border points, or these points, if you like, of tension? I would just mention three kinds of polarities or tensions. The first set of tension pits Christianity against African religion, and my colleague has spoken to that in her presentation. Of course, numerically speaking, Christianity has thrived at the expense of African religion. The significant growth of Christianity on the continent has no parallel in African religion. Here's the problem. To think in such linear terms, I believe, is to ignore the nature of African religion, which is something my colleague was just speaking to. For religion, as is understood in parts of the continent, resembles or forms a cultural substratum on which a multiplicity of identities have been imposed or superimposed. And so in Africa, south of the Sahara, Christianity or Islam cannot simply be understood as something that is planted on this vast plane of religious primitiveness. African religious consciousness is anything but a tabula rasa. And so like a dormant volcano, this religious substratum erupts repeatedly into the consciousness and beliefs of the imported religions. And so the lava of African religion runs deep in shaping the identities both of Christians and Muslims. A second kind of tension exists between Christianity and Islam. In the public sphere, we notice from, just by listening to news report, that there is a deep tension and intense antagonism between Christianity and Islam. And we find evidence and instances of mutual suspicion and ignorance of each other's traditions, which results in violent confrontations, especially in places where Islam is in the majority or claims to be in the majority. The third kind of tension concerns the intra-Christian tension, which again pits various denominations of Christianity and Christian traditions one against the other. And in this context, the overarching dynamic is one of intense competition for souls. Now, how does Catholicism fit into this hodgepodge of denominationalism? I would argue that Catholicism has sort of stood out for its commitment to what I would call social evangelism. That is a focus on service institutions, such as health, education, development, social justice, based on the Catholic social tradition. Some of the other denominations would favor a different approach, and that is the approach of prosperity, which claims that prayer and effort can translate into material gain. But I add very quickly that the priority of prosperity gospel is not simply to establish the preeminence of God over mammon. Rather, it's a recognition of the theological import of material resources and how they are to be valued, acquired, protected for the personal benefit of the professing Christian. I make my fourth point, and here I quote a veteran American missionary of several years, who claims that the African Catholic Church does remind one of the pre-Vatican II Church. Sometimes I call it the Irish Catholic Church transplanted to parts of Africa. And you could say Irish, or Italian, or Dutch, or Portuguese, depending on what you're looking at. And this reinforces the point that I'm trying to make here with regards to identities. Is the idea that the African Christian is a bearer of an identity, not necessarily his or her own. And I would like to unpack that very briefly. Of course, millions of Africans were baptized, continue to be baptized with amazing rapidity to swell the ranks of the Catholic Church and the other churches. And to be baptized, or to be a baptized Catholic, was to receive an identity that connected the initiate with a worldwide network of Catholicism. Having made these 4 points, I want to look at the question of borders, the borders of baptism. During the First African Synod, one of the bishops made this very interesting remark. He said, the saying goes among the Africans that when it comes to the crunch, it is not the Christian concept of the church as a family which prevails, but rather the adage that blood is thicker than water. And by water here, one can presumably include the waters of baptism, through which one is born into the family of the church. Blood relationship is more important, even for the African who has become a Christian. The frank admission by the bishop shows that natural ties developed through family, clan, and ethnic affiliations flow deeper and stronger than the waters of baptism. In other words, the prioritization of blood ties subordinates Christianity quite often to pathologies of tribal loyalties and clan-based identities. These relationships oftentimes take precedence over Christian values and obligations. So, at issue here, really, is the tension between kin-centered identity and faith-based identity. The former epitomized in ethnicity and tribalism, the latter in baptism. So the question for me then is to determine whether and to what extent Christian faith is supposed to bypass, negate, affirm the claims any culture has on the loyalty of its people. Baptism may confer a new identity and secure membership in the family of God, the church, but the operative family is founded on clan and tribal affiliation and obligation. So in this context, identity and belonging surface more intensely and effectively in and through the family and the clan. The loyalty or identity created by the sacramental conferment of baptism hardly matches this clan identity in strength and intensity. On the evidence of the state of contemporary African Catholicism, I believe it may be wishful thinking to assert, as someone has done, that Christian identity must be primary before state, before market, before tribe, even before biological family. Or to quote Michael Boddy, that being a Christian is one's primary and formative loyalty. Now, if examples are required to challenge this claim, one needs not look too far. The waters of baptism did not protect the victims of the Rwanda genocide, which remains a very tragic illustration of how the waters of baptism are easily polluted by the blood of tribalism. And how, quoting Emmanuel Katongole, Christianity fails to make a visible and lasting difference in Africa. I want to demonstrate this assertion more fully by indicating what I believe is a further process that is needed to strengthen the bond of baptism in the context of intensely significant natural ties. Now, in describing the formation and function of religious identity in Africa, if you notice, I've employed terms such as competition and tension. While it is true that Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular in Africa doesn't carry the weight of centuries of history and tradition, when it comes to navigating the contours of this competition and the challenges of this tension, there is much work to be done. Negotiating these contours oftentimes results in a plurality of religious identities. And this process has been pejoratively labeled as religious double-mindedness and faith schizophrenia. And here I'm quoting two prominent African churchmen, Udo and Desmond Tutu. Their point is that Africans struggle to integrate their religious identities and therefore are neither fully Christian nor solely practitioners of African religion. And as I have mentioned, the origin of this amorphous religious identity is the context and pattern of religious affiliation. That is, religious affiliation that is incarnated in overlapping and shifting platforms of beliefs, practices, and allegiances. And when you mix this with the pull factors of tribal and cultural loyalties and obligation, it produces a complexity and plurality of identities and belongings. So baptism offers one means for negotiating and fixing the borders of religious identity, but I would claim a very limited one at that, simply because in the context that I'm referring to, blood is thicker than water. And although theologians very routinely characterize the phenomenon of multiple religious identities as a schizophrenic crisis of identity, I would like to offer a more critical analysis that could allow us to put a more positive value on this experience of multiplicity of identities. From experience as a convert to Catholicism, I can say that to find oneself a part of multiple and overlapping religious and cultural communities of identity and belonging calls for a very high degree of religious competence and performance. So what I would say is that as an African, and again I refer to my experience, I am not the subject of divided loyalty. No, I believe that the African holds what I call a diffused loyalty or identity. He or she is able to hold intention and operate effectively in competing and overlapping religious spaces. And so specifically, for a baptized African Christian, whether Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, AIC, or Orthodox, baptism does not necessarily impose impenetrable borders. No. On the contrary, I believe it opens up borders. Catholic identity is never shaped in isolation from, but in relation to other religious or faith identities, the contours of which may be rigid when there's need to be rigid, or fluid when the need arises. And so for me, a Christianity without borders may yet be the most authentic manifestation and embodiment of the unity of Christ effected in baptism and sustained by the Eucharist. And so in this line of thinking, I'm deliberately connecting baptism and Eucharist. Because very often, at least the way it was introduced in this country, baptism is presented as a vertical reality, that is a transforming encounter with the living person of Christ. And the result is the formation of a spiritual identity, an inner spiritual transformation of the individual. This is one view. Now, while I do not dispute the centrality of a personal encounter with Christ for fixing religious identity, the stress that evangelical Pentecostalism places on the individuality of this encounter, I believe, evacuates the equally significant horizontal dimensions, including social, ethical, and political implications, which I believe is the more Catholic view. And so, if, as Emmanuel Katongole has argued, Christianity births an alternative constructed imagination at once social, cultural, ethical, and political, the mechanism for actualizing this imagination in the face of pathological identities and loyalties cannot be supplied solely by baptismal ablution. Alone, baptism cannot withstand the tsunami of multiple and competing identities. The Eucharist is what grounds the specifically horizontal dimension. And so for me, baptism and Eucharist play a mutually reinforcing role. The adage, blood is thicker than water, serves as a reminder of an exaggerated emphasis on baptism as a single act conferring identity on an individual Christian. And as I mentioned earlier on, and here I depart from Michael Body, it is insufficient to presume that the borders of baptism offer a stronger base for developing loyalties and identities that embody the ideals of the kingdom of God, however we define this reality called kingdom. It helps to conceive of baptism as a process leading to the formation of community. And here I would agree with my colleague, stress on relationality and relationship. It is this community that confers identity, not the act itself in isolation. The consolidation of this community is symbolized and actualized by a blood feast, the Eucharist. To partake in this feast is to recognize oneself as an integral member of and to enter into solidarity with the global body of Christ. Finally, therefore, I hold the position that in the specifically African understanding of ritual, in this case the Eucharist, Catholicism can prove effective in generating new identities and loyalties capable of attenuating and if not replacing existing pathologies of tribalism and negative ethnicity. However, for this to happen, a new understanding of the Eucharist is required. For Eucharist is indeed a spirituality that includes everything. For all who are gathered into the body of Christ through baptism, the shared Eucharist or Eucharistic meal is the seal of a new identity of solidarity, mutuality, and inclusivity. Significantly, I believe, belonging is sealed not solely by water, but by blood. And therefore, if baptism means leaving old identities and allegiances behind, Eucharist means a celebration of our identity as God's children. And so, the trajectory of identity now progresses from isolation and individuality to relationality and community. And the resulting reality is a new community characterized by its universality and its ability to operate at the interstices of the local and the global, to quote Professor Schreiter. In practical terms, therefore, identity is not simply a byproduct or an end product of baptismal experience. It is rather the catalyst for or the production of a new identity constructed and developed in the Eucharistic context. Now, whether we name this new reality an embodiment of ecclesial solidarity, the body of Christ, Eucharistic community, or simply the church makes no difference. The baptismal community is a Eucharistic community. All are welcome. For those who eat together, do not eat one another. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our speakers for raising very stimulating questions and possibilities. We have some time now to hear from you. So if anyone would like to speak, if they would approach the microphone and place their question to either of our or both of our speakers. Yes.
Thank you both very much for this really insightful and stimulating discussions. I just have an immediate reaction to the last talk, and I'm curious, since you were trying to contrast this Eucharistic community and the church, right, as something that allows us to transcend ethnic divisions, tribal identities, and so on, including national identity, which is my own concern. I'm curious, what does it do for those who don't belong to that kind of community, right? Who don't belong to the church, meaning, non-Christians, or rather non-Catholics, Muslims, secular. And so I would be curious how you can sort of reflect on that, for my own thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Basically, what I'm doing in referring to the Eucharistic community is using that as a symbol. And I'm not specifically looking at the sacramental aspects of this, but using it as a symbol that speaks to the context of Africa, where the shared meal is really a place of gathering. It's a place of gathering that transcends so many, many divisions. You see, if I could speak to a personal experience, I come from a very large family. I have 35 siblings, and growing up in a community where you had Muslims, you had Christians of all stripes, and you had the practitioners of indigenous religion, the one thing that kept us together was the meal. There you transcended differences. So I use the Eucharistic community as a kind of a symbol, a template for envisaging this possibility, this space where we can begin to transcend, or rather integrate some of these diversities and differences in healthy ways, not in pathological ways. Thank you.
Do you mind if I follow? I'm sorry, I just want to follow up very quickly. I'm just curious, how would you think about that
in those situations where we cannot eat together? And I want to push you in that direction because I know from the Bosnian context that Muslims and Catholic Croats cannot eat the same kind of food, right? For religious reasons, and in the case of Muslims in particular. So how do we think through theologically, sociologically, politically about situations in which we cannot share a meal? But I do love the image of it, and I agree with you.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think there needs to be some basic education. Okay, you might say catechesis, but I use that term very, very lightly. Some basic catechesis, because I don't think this is automatic. I would be, the last to say it just happens. There needs to be a basic catechesis that allows us to recover some of these things, traditions that we have lost, precisely because of the tensions that have developed across religions, across regions or ideologies and all of that. So I don't think it's automatic, but I think it's there as a resource. It's there as a resource that I believe we can still make an attempt to recover. And I think it's important that we don't forget that we have these resources when it comes to dealing with some of these tensions. If I may just say one more thing, the easiest way you can tell me that we are not in communion is to refuse a meal.
Thank you very much indeed. I've learned an awful lot this morning. I have two questions really, and excuse me for overloading you. One of them really is addressed the question of Catholicity versus Catholicism. I was very struck by your opposition between the two. And you talk about a limitless domain of the Spirit, and then for the Orobator, you talk about a Christianity without borders. I would contend that as a person, a human person, I actually need limits in order to engage in a relationship. Otherwise, there is no me. There's just a generic, diffused usness, I suppose. So I suppose my question is are there limits to limitlessness? Or are there points when actually has to say, okay, this is no longer, this inclusivity actually is so inclusive that it becomes meaningless. My second question really concerns, I've been learning a lot about African Christianity. I just wonder, is there anything that African Christianities can learn from other communities, not only across space, but across time? Is there something in the history of the church, in the early growth of the church, and the encounters, the pastoral, practical, theological, and political problems that history, the study of history, has to tell us? Thank you very much indeed.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I mentioned that there is a group of theologians, among whom I belong, who would prefer the word Catholicism, because then Catholicism, or rather the Catholic faith, would be seen as an ism, like any other ism. Yeah? And in that case, it would be exclusive, so that it belongs to only those who are allowed in. Yeah? But here we are saying it's limitless, not in the sense that there are no borders really, or that anything goes, but in the sense that everybody is welcome. As long as you're willing to accept the basic principles or the basic issues, you're welcome. It's not like we are saying this is only for this group. It's open. But of course there are borders. There's a limit to what will be accepted and what will not be accepted. And then the second question was on what African Christianity can learn from others. One thing is clear, that African Christianity, like we have just explained it, is riddled with a lot of, if I may call it, historical baggage, a lot of baggage. Yeah. So that, one, Africans have lost identity through history, and today Africans are claiming that identity. And Africans are wondering, how do we stand out as Africans without ourselves referring to the other? So that it gets a little difficult to think of how we can learn from other societies. But that, what I've said notwithstanding, it's critical, yes, for African Christians to look at other communities and see what it is they can borrow from their context. Like if you think in terms of history, the early church, the challenges that prevailed in the early church are more or less the challenges that prevail in the contemporary church in Africa. The divisions in terms of, these are Jews, these are Gentiles, the divisions in terms of who can be African authentically and who is not African. Those are issues that we continue to grapple with many years after the early church. So that yes, it's possible to look at other societies and learn, but at the same time, there is a challenge and some kind of wondering, could this mess our identity even more? Our identity is already messed up. How do we look to others to define ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to the first question about Christianity without borders. Now, I'm of course not advocating a sort of limitlessness. What I'm advocating is that my Christian identity is really a mandate to engage other identities, to celebrate other identities, and that my Christian identity allows me to deepen even my allegiance or my loyalty. I'll give you an example. As I said earlier on, I'm a convert to Catholicism. I grew up in the context of African religion. And I'm quite happy with my acquired identity as a Catholic. But I do know, as I said earlier on, there is something deeper there. There's the core that constantly bubbles out to the surface. And so when I wear my bead, when I wear my cowrie, that's always a reminder of where I've come from and how this continues to engage me to understand my identity as an African Catholic or Christian, you see. And in terms of when you talk about history, is there anything, there's a lot I believe we can learn. I think one thing we can learn, not to go into details, is to learn to appreciate the role of culture. You see, when Christianity came to the continent, what was preached, so to speak, as Christians, we had a lot of cultural baggage. And I think to learn to appreciate that, culture matters, and to be aware of that, so that we can challenge it when we need to, and appreciate and celebrate it when we need to. For me, that's very critical. The other things we will talk about. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I believe we have time for one final question, contribution.
I'm returning from Kenya. I spent 15 years over there, and so your talks were very energetic for me. One thing I want to say about Kenya, one of the things that I am aware of, that in 1900 there were 8,000 Catholics. Today there are over 10 million. This is not just Kenya. It's Tanzania, it's Uganda, it's Sudan. The enormous evangelization that went on is comparable to nothing in the history of the church. And I don't know if you can maybe comment on that. The other thing I want to say is Malingo. I know the story of Malingo, and I know of the work that he was doing in Zambia. I know that he was involved in healing, charismatic. The church hierarchy was upset with him. They pulled him over to Rome. They kept him under house arrest for many years. He leaves and comes back to speak about other things. Talks about the oppressive celibacy that's in the church and so forth. And eventually winds up leaving, and he marries a Mooney and starts his own church. There's a story to this, and I think it's also the oppression of the hierarchy on this man and not listening to this upstart bishop. And finally, I think that there is a tension between the institutional church and the spirit fighting one another, and I think Africa faces that. So I really appreciate what you have to say.
Yes, there has been enormous growth in Africa, from so few to so many. But even as we celebrate it, I think we should also be conscious that, as somebody has put it, Christianity may be very many kilometers long, but very few inches deep. And it's because of all these challenges that we are talking about. So that there is actually a call or a challenge to deepen Catholic faith in Africa, in spite of the numbers. Thank you for the comment on Milingo. Yes, there are issues of hierarchy there, and but probably, I don't know. Let me not comment on that because I'm not quite well versed in that. And then, thank you for the comment. Yes, there is a tension between institution and the spirit. And that's something that we probably need to address and look into, because it's very critical tension when there is such, it's a critical tension when it's between an institution and between the spirit. It needs to be addressed. Thank you for the comments.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to pay tribute to the enormous work that's been done on the continent. You just spent 15 years in Kenya, and the enormous work that's been done on the continent at great sacrifice. If you remember the quotation I started my presentation with, I was raised by missionaries, so I have a personal connection to that. And as you said, the recent statistics, or not too recent statistics from the Pew Foundation, is that in 1910, we had 1.2 million Catholics on the continent. In 2010, we have 173 million. Now, I want to really also reinforce what my colleague here has just said, that, there is sometimes a myth of numbers, and we can become quite fascinated by the myth of numbers and talk about growth, but also realize that there are very, very concrete challenges that a church like this on the continent faces, and we shouldn't forget that. That's, numbers do not simply make up for everything. There are serious challenges that we face as a church. But thank you very much.
Okay, let's take this opportunity to thank once again our two presenters.